The dust had barely settled from the morning stampede when Marcus Whitmore received the letter that would change everything. Standing on the wraparound porch of his sprawling ranch house, leather boots polished to mirror shine, he held the envelope like it contained fire itself. The Whitmore name was carved into every fence post for 50 miles in either direction. Cattle grazed on land that stretched beyond the horizon. Oil wells pumped black gold from beneath his feet, and his bank account could buy half the territory without breaking a sweat. But none of that mattered when he saw the careful handwriting that spelled out his name in faded ink. Inside that letter was a photograph, a simple tintype, edges worn soft from handling. The face that stared back at him belonged to a girl he had never met, but somehow recognized in his bones. Dark eyes that held secrets, a smile that seemed to know something the world had forgotten, and a presence that reached through paper and time to grab him by the throat. Below the photograph, 3 lines of text that would haunt his dreams. This is my daughter, Sarah May. She lives in Clearwater Springs. She needs help more than she needs hope. Marcus had built his fortune on quick decisions and calculated risks. He could read cattle markets like scripture, predict weather patterns better than the almanac, and negotiate deals that left seasoned businessmen scratching their heads in admiration. But this photograph did something to him that no boardroom or battlefield ever had. It made him feel like a 16-year-old boy again, heart hammering against his ribs, palms sweating despite the cool mountain air. He studied every detail of that face until he could have drawn it from memory in complete darkness. 300 miles separated his ranch from Clearwater Springs. 300 miles of rough terrain, dangerous passes, and settlements that barely qualified as dots on a map. For most men, it would have been an impossible journey. For Marcus Whitmore, it was Tuesday. He called for his best horse, packed supplies that would last a month, and left instructions with his foreman that sounded more like a last will and testament than travel plans. Because something in that photograph told him he might not be coming back the same man who left. The journey began before dawn, when the world was painted in shades of gray and possibility. Marcus rode hard through valleys that had never seen railroad tracks, across rivers that ran wild and untamed, past mountains that scraped the belly of the sky. He carried that photograph in his breast pocket, pressed close to his heart, and every mile that passed beneath his horse's hooves felt like a prayer he did not know he was praying. At night, when he made camp under stars that looked different than the ones above his ranch, he would pull out that tintype and wonder what kind of man travels 300 miles for a girl he has never spoken to. But it was not just the photograph that drove him forward. It was the story behind it. The letter had come from a stranger, a woman who claimed to know his late mother, who spoke of debts that could not be measured in dollars and promises that transcended generations. Sarah May was not just any girl in need. She was the daughter of the woman who had saved his mother's life 20 years ago, during a winter so brutal that entire families froze to death in their beds. A debt of honor, the letter had called it. A chance to repay kindness with kindness, love with love, hope with something stronger than hope. As the miles disappeared behind him, Marcus began to understand that this journey was changing him in ways he could not name. The man who had left the ranch was accustomed to getting what he wanted through power, influence, and the weight of his family name. But the man riding toward Clearwater Springs was learning something different. He was learning that some things could not be bought, some hearts could not be conquered, and some journeys mattered more than their destinations. On the 4th day, when his horse was lathered with sweat and his own clothes were stained with dust and determination, Marcus crested a hill and saw Clearwater Springs spread out below him like a question mark carved into the earth. It was not much to look at. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that looked like it had been designed by someone who had never seen a proper town. But somewhere in that collection of hope and hardship lived the girl whose photograph had turned his world upside down. He found her at the general store, weighing flour with hands that looked too delicate for the work they were doing. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times it told its own story of perseverance and her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested practicality over vanity. But when she looked up and their eyes met across that cramped store, Marcus felt like he had been struck by lightning and blessed by angels in the same instant. "You must be Sarah May," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of a man accustomed to command but tempered with something softer, something that sounded almost like reverence. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his expensive clothes, his confident posture, the way he filled the doorway like he owned everything he surveyed. Her response came slowly, measured, as if she were weighing each word before letting it loose in the world. "And you must be the rich cowboy who thinks 300 miles makes him entitled to whatever he wants." The words hit Marcus harder than any physical blow. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even swooning admiration. He had ridden 300 miles expecting to be received as a hero, a savior, an answer to prayers that had been whispered in the dark. Instead, he found himself face to face with a girl who looked at his wealth like it was something that needed to be washed off, who measured his character not by the size of his ranch, but by something deeper, something he was not sure he possessed. "I came because of your mother," he said, reaching for the letter in his pocket. "Because of what she did for my family. Because sometimes debts transcend generations, and love travels farther than money ever could." Sarah May set down the flower, dusted her hands on her apron, and fixed him with a stare that seemed to see straight through his expensive clothes to whatever soul lived beneath them. The entire store had gone silent. Even the flies seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen when unstoppable wealth met immovable principle. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and her voice carried the weight of mountains, the depth of rivers, and the strength of women who had learned to survive without rescue. "You may have ridden 300 miles, but you still have not traveled far enough to understand what I actually need." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. In all his calculations, in all his preparation for this moment, he had never considered the possibility that his grand gesture might not be enough, that money and good intentions and 300 miles of determination might pale in comparison to something he had never learned to recognize, much less possess. "Then tell me," he said, and for the first time in years, his voice carried no trace of command, no assumption of authority, only a question, honest and vulnerable and desperate. "Tell me what you need." Sarah May looked at him for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The silence stretched between them like a bridge that neither was sure could bear their weight. When she finally spoke, her words would echo through that store, through that town, and through Marcus Whitmore's heart for the rest of his days. "I need you to prove that your heart traveled those 300 miles along with your body." The challenge hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunfighter's pistol. Marcus had faced down cattle rustlers, negotiated with railroad barons, and stared down the barrel of more than one loaded gun. But nothing had prepared him for the quiet intensity of Sarah May's gaze. She had not raised her voice, had not moved from behind that worn wooden counter, but somehow she had managed to strip away every layer of armor he had spent years building around himself. "My heart," he repeated slowly, tasting the words like they were written in a language he was still learning to speak. And how exactly does a man prove such a thing to a woman who has already decided his money makes him suspect? Sarah May's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile, but was not entirely unkind either. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a ledger, its pages yellowed with age and use, its binding held together with string and stubborn determination. "This book contains the names of every family in Clearwater Springs who owes money to the general store," she said, running her finger down columns of faded numbers. 43 families, Mr. Whitmore. 43 families who cannot afford flour for their children's bread, medicine for their sick, or fabric to mend the clothes that are falling apart on their backs. Marcus stepped closer, drawn by something in her voice that reminded him of church bells and prayer meetings, of things sacred and worth protecting. The ledger looked like it had seen more heartbreak than a preacher's confession booth. "My father owns this store," she continued, her voice steady but carrying undercurrents of pain that ran deeper than mountain streams. Or rather, the bank owns this store, and my father manages it until they decide we are no longer useful. Every name in this book represents a choice. Feed our neighbors or pay our debts. Show mercy or show profit. She looked up at him then, and Marcus saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. It was not pity she was asking for, not charity in the traditional sense. It was something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable. So here is how you prove your heart traveled those 300 miles, rich cowboy. You do not pay off this ledger. You do not throw money at problems like they are fires that need dousing. You roll up those expensive sleeves, you get those soft hands dirty, and you help us figure out how to make this town survive without your rescue. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had ridden 300 miles expecting to be the answer to problems he had never bothered to understand. He had come prepared to be a savior, but had never considered the possibility that salvation might require him to become something entirely different. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he said, and his voice carried none of its usual authority. Only genuine curiosity and something that sounded almost like humility. Sarah May closed the ledger with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the entire store. Around them, the few other customers had stopped pretending to shop and were listening with the intensity of people watching a miracle unfold in real time. "I am asking you to stay," she said simply. Not as Marcus Whitmore, owner of the largest ranch in 3 territories. Not as the man whose name opens doors and whose money solves problems. I am asking you to stay as the man who claims his heart traveled 300 miles and prove that claim by using that heart to understand what this place really needs. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, like tectonic plates moving after years of stillness. Stay. The word was so simple, so ordinary, but coming from her lips, it sounded like the most radical proposition he had ever heard. Men like him did not stay in places like Clearwater Springs. They visited, they conquered, they left their mark and moved on to the next challenge. "And if I stay," he said carefully, "what then? What does a rich cowboy do in a town that does not want his money?" Sarah May's expression softened slightly, like ice beginning to thaw at the edges. She gestured toward the window, where the main street of Clearwater Springs stretched out like a promise that had been broken too many times to believe in anymore. "You learn," she said. "You learn that Mrs. Henderson's husband died in the mine collapse last spring, and she has been trying to feed 4 children on seamstress work that barely pays enough for thread. You learn that the school has not had proper books for 2 years because the territorial government considers us too small to matter. You learn that our doctor is 73 years old and his hands shake too badly to deliver babies anymore." Each word was like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread out in directions Marcus had never considered. He had spent so many years seeing problems as things to be solved with money and power that he had forgotten there were other kinds of solutions, other ways of measuring worth. "You learn," Sarah May continued, her voice growing stronger with each syllable, "that sometimes the best thing a rich man can do is figure out how to make other people rich. Not with handouts, not with charity that makes them feel small, but with opportunities that let them stand tall." Marcus found himself nodding, though he was not entirely sure what he was agreeing to. There was something about the way she spoke that reminded him of his mother, who had died when he was barely old enough to remember her voice, but who had left behind stories of kindness that echoed through his childhood like distant thunder. "Your mother," he said suddenly, remembering the letter that had brought him here in the first place. "The woman who saved my mother during that terrible winter. Is she still alive?" Something flickered across Sarah May's face, too quick to identify but deep enough to matter. She looked down at her hands, which were clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "She died 3 months ago," Sarah May said quietly. "Pneumonia. We could not afford the medicine that might have saved her." She looked up at Marcus then, and her eyes held a pain so raw it made him want to look away. "That is when I wrote the letter. Not because I wanted your money, but because my mother made me promise something before she died." The store had gone so quiet, Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Whatever Sarah May was about to tell him, he knew it would change everything, would rewrite the story he had been telling himself about this journey, about this girl, about the reasons men travel impossible distances for hearts they have never held. "She made you promise what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah May reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle, wrapped carefully and tied with faded ribbon. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to unwrap it, revealing something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. It was a ring, not expensive, not ornate, but clearly precious beyond measure. A simple band of silver with a small stone that caught the light like captured starfire. "She made me promise," Sarah May said, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to gather in her eyes, "that when Marcus Whitmore's son came looking for her daughter, I would give him the same choice she gave his mother 20 years ago." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. His mother had never mentioned a ring, never spoken of choices or promises or debts that transcended generations. But looking at that simple silver band, he felt the weight of history settling around his shoulders like a cloak he had never known he was meant to wear. "What choice?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer would require everything he had, everything he was, and everything he might become. Sarah May held the ring up to the light, and for a moment it seemed to hold all the hope and heartbreak that had ever existed in places like Clearwater Springs. "The choice," she said, "to love someone not for what you can give them, but for what they can teach you about what it means to be human." The ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the store window, casting tiny rainbows across the worn wooden counter like promises scattered by an unseen hand. Marcus stared at it, his throat tight with emotions he had no names for. 20 years ago, his mother had faced this same choice, had held this same ring, had made a decision that would echo through generations like ripples across still water. "Tell me about the choice," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Tell me what my mother chose." Sarah May cradled the ring in her palm as if it were a living thing, fragile and precious beyond measure. The other customers had long since given up any pretense of shopping, drawn into the unfolding story like moths to flame. Even old Mr. Peterson, who had been pretending to examine the same bolt of fabric for 10 minutes, leaned closer to hear her words. "Your mother came here in the winter of 1849, Sarah May began, her voice taking on the cadence of stories told by firelight, passed down through generations of women who understood that some truths were too important to be forgotten. She was pregnant, alone, running from something she never spoke about. The snow was so deep that winter that people were dying in their sleep, frozen solid before morning came." Marcus felt his chest constrict. His father had told him his mother died in childbirth, but had never mentioned she had been running, never spoken of the circumstances that brought her to this remote corner of the territory. "My mother found her collapsed outside our cabin," Sarah May continued, her fingers tracing the ring's simple band. "Half dead from cold and hunger, but still fighting to protect the life growing inside her. Mama brought her in, nursed her back to health, delivered you when the time came." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Marcus had always wondered why his earliest memories were not of the grand ranch house where he had grown up, but of a small cabin with rough-hewn walls and a stone fireplace that seemed to hold all the warmth in the world. "But that was not the choice," Sarah May said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The choice came after you were born, when your father's men finally tracked her down." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. His father, Jeremiah Whitmore, had been a hard man, successful but ruthless, the kind who took what he wanted and asked questions later. The idea that his mother had been running from him, that their marriage might have been something other than the love story he had been told, sent cracks spreading through the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself. "He came with 6 men and enough gold to buy half the territory," Sarah May continued. "He wanted his son back, wanted your mother back. wanted to erase the months of her absence like they had never happened. But Mama saw something in your mother's eyes, something that said rescue might be just another kind of prison. Sarah May held up the ring, letting it catch the light again. So Mama gave your mother a choice. She could take this ring, accept it as a symbol of the freedom to choose her own path, her own future. Or she could go back to the life she had been running from, to the safety and wealth that came with being Jeremiah Whitmore's wife. The silence that followed was so complete Marcus could hear dust motes settling on the floorboards. Every person in that store was holding their breath, waiting to learn what choice had shaped the life of the man standing before them. She chose the ring, Sarah May said simply. She chose freedom over security, uncertainty over comfort, the possibility of building something real over the guarantee of having everything provided for her. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet once again. Everything he had believed about his parents, about his own origins, about the wealth and power that had shaped his entire existence, suddenly seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. "But then how did I end up at the ranch?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How did I become Jeremiah Whitmore's son if she chose to stay here?" Sarah May's expression grew infinitely sad, like someone forced to deliver news that would break hearts and shatter dreams. She wrapped the ring carefully back in its cloth bundle, her movements precise and reverent. "Because 3 days after she made that choice, she died," Sarah May whispered. "Fever took her fast, like it sometimes does after childbirth. Her last words were about you, about the promise she made Mama swear to keep." The world seemed to tilt and blur around the edges. Marcus gripped the counter to keep himself steady, his mind reeling with the implications of what he was hearing. His mother had died free, had died having made her own choice, but had left him to be raised by the very man she had been running from. "What promise?" he managed to ask, though his voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone far away. "That when you grew up, when you became a man and started making your own choices, someone would tell you the truth," Sarah May said. "That you would know your mother chose love over gold, chose dignity over comfort, chose the hardest path because it was the only one that let her keep her soul." She unwrapped the ring again, holding it out toward him like an offering or a challenge. "And that when the time came, you would be given the same choice she was given, not just with words, but with actions that prove what kind of man you really are." Marcus stared at the ring, understanding beginning to dawn like sunrise over mountains he had never seen before. This was not just about him and Sarah May, not just about a rich cowboy riding 300 miles for a poor girl's heart. This was about cycles and choices, about the debts that pass between generations and the ways love travels through time like seeds on the wind. "So the choice is not whether you will have me," Sarah May said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The choice is whether you will have yourself, whether you will be the man who uses his wealth to build prisons for the people he claims to love, or the man who uses everything he has been given to set them free." She placed the ring on the counter between them, a small silver bridge spanning the gulf between who he had always been and who he might become. Around them, the store full of neighbors and strangers waited with the patience of people who understood that some moments could not be rushed. Some decisions could not be made with anything but the deepest parts of the human heart. "If you take this ring," Sarah May said, her eyes never leaving his face, "you are not just asking me to marry you. You are promising to stay here, to become part of this community, to use your gifts and your resources not to rescue us, but to walk alongside us as we rescue ourselves." Marcus felt his hand moving toward the ring before his mind had fully processed her words. Something in his chest was pulling him forward, some gravity he had never felt before but recognized like a song his mother had sung to him in dreams. "And if I do not take the ring?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would cut him deeper than any blade ever could. Sarah May's smile was infinitely gentle and infinitely final. "Then you ride back to your ranch, back to your comfortable life, back to the man you have always been. And someday you find another woman who will be grateful enough for your money to pretend that gratitude is love." She paused, letting him feel the weight of that possibility. The hollow echo of a life lived without transformation, without risk, without the kind of love that demanded everything and offered everything in return. "But you will always wonder," she added, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the dust and silence of the store. "You will always wonder what would have happened if you had been brave enough to choose the harder path, the one that leads through uncertainty toward something real." Marcus reached out, his fingers hovering just above the ring like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step forward would change everything and there would be no going back. The silver band seemed to pulse with its own light, with the accumulated weight of choices made and unmade, of love offered and accepted and transformed into something larger than the people who carried it. In that moment, suspended between decision and action, between the man he had always been and the man he might become, Marcus Whitmore understood what his mother had known 20 years ago in this same place, facing this same impossible choice. That sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is exactly what your heart tells you is right. The ring lay there between them, patient as eternity, waiting for him to prove that his heart had indeed traveled those 300 miles, and was ready to travel 300 more, and 300 more after that, for as long as love required him to keep moving toward the truth of what it meant to be human. His fingers closed around the ring with a certainty that surprised him. The silver was warm against his palm, as if it had been waiting 20 years for this moment, for this choice, for this man to finally understand what his mother had tried to teach him through her sacrifice. The metal seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, and Marcus felt something inside his chest crack open like ice breaking up in spring. "I take it," he said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his soul. "Not because I think I deserve you, not because my money gives me the right to your heart, but because I want to learn what love looks like when it is not built on what a man owns, but on who he chooses to become." Sarah May's eyes filled with tears that caught the afternoon light like tiny stars. She did not throw herself into his arms, did not swoon with gratitude or relief. Instead, she studied his face with the intensity of someone reading scripture, looking for truth in the spaces between words. "Then prove it," she said simply, not with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but with the slow, quiet work of becoming the kind of man who belongs in a place like this. Marcus slipped the ring into his vest pocket, next to his heart, where it seemed to settle like it had always belonged there. Around them, the store erupted in whispers and murmurs, the sound of a community witnessing something they had never expected to see. A rich man choosing the harder path, a powerful man surrendering his power for something more valuable than control. That night, Marcus made camp on the outskirts of Clearwater Springs, his expensive horse tethered next to a creek that sang lullabies to the stars. He had enough money in his saddlebags to buy the finest room in the territory's best hotel, but something about sleeping under the same sky that sheltered the people he hoped to serve felt more honest than silk sheets and crystal chandeliers. He pulled out paper and pen, writing by firelight to his foreman back at the ranch. The letter was longer than any he had ever written, full of instructions that would have seemed impossible coming from the Marcus Whitmore who had left 4 days ago. Sell half the cattle. Convert the east pasture to farmland for sharecroppers. Establish a fund for families who needed help but were too proud to ask for charity. And most importantly, prepare for a new kind of life, one measured not in acres owned or dollars earned, but in problems solved and hearts healed. The next morning brought news that would test his resolve before he had even unpacked his commitment. A rider arrived in town with word that the railroad company was planning to buy out every property in Clearwater Springs, turn the entire settlement into a depot for shipping cattle to eastern markets. The offer was generous, enough to make every family wealthy by local standards, but it would mean the end of everything that made the town worth saving. Marcus found Sarah May at the schoolhouse, teaching 15 children whose ages ranged from 6 to 16, all crammed into a single room with books so worn the words were barely visible on the pages. She looked up when he entered, her face calm but her eyes questioning. "Did you hear about the railroad offer?" he asked without preamble. "I heard," she said, dismissing the children for an early recess with a gesture that sent them tumbling out the door like autumn leaves caught in wind. "And I suppose you think this is where your money becomes useful?" Marcus shook his head, surprising himself with the speed of his response. "No. I think this is where we find out if this community is strong enough to choose its own future, or if we are all just waiting for someone else to decide what our lives are worth." Sarah May set down the piece of chalk she had been holding, her expression shifting from wariness to something that might have been hope. "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting we call a town meeting," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Let everyone hear the railroad offer, understand exactly what they are being asked to give up and what they stand to gain. Then let them decide, together, what kind of future they want to build." That evening, the town gathered in the church, the only building large enough to hold everyone who had a stake in the decision. Families sat in pews worn smooth by generations of prayer and grief and celebration, their faces reflecting the complexity of people forced to choose between security and sovereignty. The railroad representative was a thin man in an expensive suit who spoke about progress and prosperity with the confidence of someone who had never wondered where his next meal would come from. He painted pictures of wealth and opportunity, of children who would grow up with advantages their parents had never imagined. When he finished, the silence in the church was so complete it seemed to have weight. Then Sarah May stood, her simple dress and work-worn hands a stark contrast to the railroad man's polished presentation. "Mr. Davidson speaks about prosperity," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the church. "But he does not speak about the cost of that prosperity. He does not mention that the railroad's depot will bring saloons and gambling halls, that our children will grow up in a place where money matters more than neighbors, where success is measured by what you can take rather than what you can give." Murmurs rippled through the congregation like wind through wheat. Marcus felt his heart swelling with pride and something deeper, something that felt like recognition. This was why he had ridden 300 miles, though he had not known it at the time. Not to rescue Sarah May, but to witness her strength, to learn from her wisdom, to become worthy of walking beside someone who understood what was truly valuable in this world. "But," Sarah May continued, her eyes finding Marcus in the crowd, "we also cannot pretend that pride will feed our children or that principles will pay for the medicine when sickness comes. So I propose we consider a third option, one that requires more courage than taking the railroad's money but offers more hope than simply refusing it." She gestured toward Marcus, who rose slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment of truth, the place where his promises would either take root or wither like plants in drought. "Marcus Whitmore has offered to invest his resources not in buying our town, but in helping us build something that belongs to us," Sarah May said. "A cooperative that would allow us to process and ship our own goods, to keep the profits here instead of sending them east to men who have never walked our streets or learned our names." The idea hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and fragile and full of possibility. Marcus stepped forward, his voice finding strength he had not known he possessed. "I am not asking you to trust me because of my money," he said, looking into the faces of people who had every reason to be suspicious of men like him. "I am asking you to trust yourselves, to believe that together we can build something better than what others are willing to give us." Old Mrs. Henderson, the widow with 4 children, raised her hand. "And what happens when you get tired of playing at being poor folks? What happens when you decide this little experiment is not worth your time?" The question cut deep because it was fair, because it acknowledged the reality that rich men often treated other people's lives like interesting hobbies to be taken up and discarded when novelty wore thin. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, holding it up so everyone could see the simple silver band that carried 20 years of history and hope. "This ring belonged to my mother," he said, his voice carrying across the church like a prayer. "She chose love over security, chose freedom over comfort, chose to trust in something bigger than herself. If I break faith with this community, I break faith with her memory." He looked directly at Sarah May, letting everyone see the truth written on his face. "And I break faith with the woman I hope to marry, who has taught me that love is not something you acquire, but something you become worthy of. Day by day, choice by choice. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 37 families chose to stay and build, to risk uncertainty for the possibility of something unprecedented. The railroad man left the next morning, his briefcase full of unsigned contracts and his face wearing the expression of someone who could not understand why people would choose the harder path when the easier one came with guaranteed payment. Marcus sold his ranch 3 weeks later, keeping only enough to buy a modest house in Clearwater Springs and to fund the cooperative that would become the economic heart of the community's transformation. The man who had once owned more land than some small countries now found himself learning to build chicken coops and repair wagon wheels, to balance ledger books for a general store, and to teach arithmetic to children who had never imagined they could learn such things. Sarah May watched him fumble through tasks that should have been beneath a man of his former station, never offering help he had not asked for, never making the work easier than it needed to be. She understood that his hands needed to grow calloused, that his back needed to learn the weight of honest labor, that his heart needed to discover what it felt like to be valued for what he contributed rather than what he possessed. On a crisp October evening, 6 months after he had first walked into that general store, Marcus found Sarah May sitting by the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. She was grading papers by lantern light, her face peaceful in the golden glow, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he had never seen before. "I have something to ask you," he said, settling beside her on the fallen log that had become their favorite place to talk about the day's challenges and victories. She looked up from the arithmetic problems she had been correcting, her eyes reflecting the lantern light like dark water under stars. "I thought you might." Marcus pulled out the ring, no longer new and shiny, but worn smooth by months of being carried close to his heart. "I know I'm not the same man who rode into town 6 months ago. I know my hands are harder and my back is stronger, and my understanding of what matters is completely different than it was when I thought 300 miles was a long distance to travel for love." Sarah May set down her pen and turned to face him fully, her attention complete and unwavering. "But I also know that I am still learning, still becoming the man who might be worthy of wearing this ring on his finger while you wear its match on yours," Marcus continued. "So I am not asking you to marry me because I have proven myself. I am asking you to marry me because I want to spend the rest of my life proving myself every single day, in all the small ways that matter." Sarah May reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that honest work and genuine worry had carved around his eyes. "You rode 300 miles thinking you were coming to rescue me," she said softly, "but you stayed 6 months and let me rescue you instead." She took the ring from his palm, holding it up to catch the lantern light one more time. "The answer is yes, Marcus Whitmore. Not because you have proven yourself, but because you have proven that you understand what needs proving." They were married on a Sunday in November, when the leaves had turned to gold and the air carried promises of snow. The entire town gathered in the church, the same building where they had voted to bet their futures on cooperation rather than capitulation. Sarah May wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and Marcus wore a simple black suit that he had bought from the same general store where he had first seen her weighing flour. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher, but the real vows were spoken in the months that followed, in the daily choice to build something together that was larger than either of them alone. They learned that love was not a destination, but a direction, not something you achieved, but something you practiced, like a craft that required patience and dedication and the willingness to begin again every morning. Their first child was born the following autumn, a daughter with Sarah May's dark eyes and Marcus's stubborn chin. They named her Grace, after the thing that had brought them together and the thing that kept them growing toward each other even when the work was hard and the future was uncertain. And sometimes, when the evening light slanted through the windows of their simple house and their daughter played at their feet with toys carved by neighbors who had become family, Marcus would remember the man who had ridden 300 miles expecting to buy love with money and good intentions. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he had known long ago, but had outgrown like clothes that no longer fit, The true distance he had traveled was not measured in miles but in understanding, not in geography but in the geography of the heart. He had learned that the richest man was not the one who owned the most, but the one who belonged most completely to something worth serving, and in serving others, in choosing the harder path that led through humility toward grace, he had found not just love, but the man he had been meant to be all along. Years passed like seasons through wheat fields, each one bringing its own harvests and hardships, its own lessons about what it meant to build a life worth living. The cooperative flourished, not without struggle, but with the kind of growth that comes from deep roots and patient tending. Children who had once learned arithmetic from worn books now attended a school with proper supplies and teachers who stayed because they wanted to, not because they had nowhere else to go. Marcus found himself changing in ways he could never have predicted. His hands, once soft from a life of privilege, now bore the honest scars of a man who understood the weight of real work. His back had learned to bend without breaking. His heart had learned to find joy in victories measured not in gold, but in the laughter of children who had enough to eat, and the quiet satisfaction of neighbors who could hold their heads high. But perhaps the most profound change was in how he measured time itself. The man who had once counted success in quarterly profits now marked the passage of days by different rhythms. The first smile from a baby who had been born healthy because the town finally had a proper doctor. The moment when old Mr. Peterson's arthritis improved enough for him to work his forge again. The evening when Sarah May looked across their dinner table and said, with wonder in her voice, that she could not remember the last time she had gone to bed hungry. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as autumn painted the hills in shades of fire and gold, Sarah May found Marcus sitting on their front porch, holding a letter that had arrived that morning. His face was unreadable, but she knew him well enough by now to recognize the stillness that came over him when the past reached out to touch the present. "News from the old life?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy intimacy of people who had learned to share both burdens and blessings. Marcus nodded slowly, holding up the envelope with its expensive paper and elaborate seal. "From my father's lawyers. Jeremiah Whitmore is dead." The words hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Sarah May waited, understanding that some news needed time to settle before its meaning became clear. "He left everything to me," Marcus continued, his voice carrying emotions too complex to untangle. "The ranch, the cattle operations, the oil wells, the investments, all of it." Sarah May felt her breath catch. The fortune Marcus had walked away from 5 years ago had grown even larger in his absence, swollen by the kind of success that came to men who never questioned whether their prosperity was built on other people's suffering. "What will you do?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. The man sitting beside her was not the same one who had ridden 300 miles for her heart. This man understood that some inheritance were curses disguised as gifts. Marcus folded the letter carefully, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. "I will accept it," he said, surprising her. "All of it." Before Sarah May could respond, he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But not to keep, to give away. To turn it into something my mother would have recognized, something that serves life instead of consuming it." Over the following months, Marcus worked with lawyers and accountants to dismantle the empire his father had built. The ranch was divided among the families who had worked it, transformed from a feudal kingdom into a collection of independent farms. The oil wells were sold, their profits used to establish schools and hospitals in communities that had been forgotten by progress. The investments were liquidated, their value converted into a foundation that would provide opportunities for people who had been born with nothing but dreams and determination. It was slow work, complicated by legal challenges and the resistance of men who profited from the old system. But Marcus had learned patience in Clearwater Springs, had discovered that the most worthwhile changes happen not in dramatic gestures, but in the steady accumulation of choices that honored human dignity over human greed. Sarah May watched her husband navigate this dismantling of his inheritance with the same careful attention he had once brought to learning how to shoe horses and balance ledger books. She saw how the work both exhausted and energized him, how each transaction brought him closer to becoming the man his mother had hoped he would be. Their second child was born during this time of transformation, a son they named Samuel after Sarah May's father. Unlike his sister, who had inherited her mother's quiet intensity, Samuel seemed to carry within him all the restless energy of his father's journey, the constant motion of someone still becoming. One evening, as Marcus rocked his son to sleep while Grace played with wooden blocks at their feet, Sarah May found herself thinking about the photograph that had started it all, the simple tintype that had traveled 300 miles in a letter from a dying woman, carrying with it the weight of promises made and kept across generations. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, her voice soft enough not to wake the baby, "what would have happened if that photograph had never reached you? If my mother had taken her secrets to the grave and you had never known about the choice your mother made?" Marcus looked up from Samuel's sleeping face, his eyes reflecting the firelight that danced in their stone hearth. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "But then I realize it does not matter. The choice would have found me eventually, in some other form, at some other crossroads, because some decisions are not about circumstances. They are about who we are when everything else is stripped away." He stood carefully, carrying Samuel to his cradle before returning to sit beside Sarah May on the sofa they had built together from wood cut in their own forest. "Your mother did not send me that photograph to rescue you," he said, taking her hand in his. "She sent it to rescue me, from a life that would have made me rich but left me empty, from a legacy that would have honored my father's memory while betraying my mother's sacrifice." Outside their windows, Clearwater Springs settled into the rhythm of evening. Lanterns flickered to life in windows, where families gathered around tables laden with food they had grown themselves or earned through honest labor. Children played in streets that were safe because neighbors looked out for each other, not because they had hired men with guns to keep trouble away. The town had grown in the years since Marcus's arrival, but it had grown carefully, with attention to the values that made growth worthwhile. New families were welcomed not because they brought wealth, but because they brought skills and hearts willing to contribute to something larger than themselves. The cooperative had expanded to include not just farming and manufacturing, but education and healthcare, creating a web of mutual support that made individual failure less likely and collective success more meaningful. As their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Sarah May surprised Marcus with a gift that brought tears to his eyes. It was a book, bound in leather and filled with photographs documenting the transformation of Clearwater Springs. Images of the old general store beside pictures of the new community center, the one-room schoolhouse next to the modern building that now housed 3 full-time teachers. Portraits of families who had arrived with nothing and were now thriving, their faces radiant with the kind of prosperity that could not be measured in dollars. But the most precious photographs were the personal ones. Marcus learning to milk a cow, his expensive clothes replaced by overalls, and his confident expression replaced by the concentration of someone discovering that competence had to be earned. Sarah May teaching their children to read, using books they could afford because the community had prioritized education over individual accumulation. The two of them working side by side in their garden, their hands dirty and their faces peaceful with the satisfaction of people who had found their place in the world. "This is who we became," Sarah May said as they turned through the pages together. "This is what happens when love travels not just 300 miles, but through time itself, carrying forward the best of what came before, while creating something entirely new." On their anniversary night, they walked together to the creek where Marcus had first asked her to marry him. The ring he had given her that evening had worn thin from years of honest work, its silver surface marked by the same kind of honorable scars that covered their hands and hearts. "If you could go back," Sarah May asked as they sat on their favorite fallen log, now weathered by a decade of conversations and dreams, "would you tell that rich cowboy anything different about what he was riding toward?" Marcus considered the question seriously, as he considered all of Sarah May's questions. She had taught him that casual answers were disrespectful to the depth of human experience, that real love required the courage to think deeply about what mattered most. "I would tell him that 300 miles was just the beginning," he said finally, "that the real journey would not be measured in distance, but in the willingness to be transformed by love, to let it remake him into someone he never imagined he could become." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of people who had learned to move through life as partners in something sacred. "And I would tell him that the poor girl's heart he was riding toward was actually the richest thing he would ever find, not because of what she would give him, but because of what she would teach him about what it meant to give himself." Above them, stars wheeled through a sky unmarked by the smoke of industry or the harsh light of cities that never slept. In the distance, they could hear the gentle sounds of their community settling into night. Children being tucked into beds, adults sharing quiet conversations about tomorrow's work, the soft lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through wheat that would soon be ready for harvest. This was the reply that had left everyone speechless, Sarah May realized. Not words spoken in a single moment, but a life lived in response to love's invitation. Not a dramatic declaration, but the quiet testimony of two people who had chosen each other not once, but every day, who had discovered that the greatest riches were found not in what you could accumulate, but in what you were willing to become. As they walked back toward their house, where their children slept safely and their tomorrow waited with all its possibilities and challenges, Marcus understood that he had finally traveled the full distance his heart had been trying to cover. Not 300 miles across difficult terrain, but the infinite space between who he had been and who love had made him. And that journey, he knew now, would continue for as long as he drew breath, carrying him always toward deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly, completely, impossibly rich.